remind everybody I'm the moderator of this panel. Let me say, about a year ago in June of 2023, we got together with the Lane Center, got together with Arizona State and the Hobby Center at the University of Houston, and we did a lengthy poll with YouGov, The Economist, on questions of migration, who moves from what state, why do they move, economics, politics. And on the basis of that poll, which it was the exact same questions in each state conducted at exactly the same time, on the basis of that, our panel today is going to discuss the migration issue. Some of them will talk a little bit about politics, some won't. They'll talk about what they wish to talk about. Each will have up to 20 minutes. After 20 minutes, I'll do something to pass them a note or something, and then we'll have questions. So our panelists are Preeti Haymeyer, who's the managing director of California Policy Research Institute and one of the people that helped us finish this survey. And there are biographies of everyone here. Dick Murray is an old friend. In my view, he's the leading expert on Texas politics. Done polling, election night commentary. At present, he is a senior research associate at the Hobby School of Public Affairs. Scott Wilkin is the Data Advisory Program Manager of the Maricopa Association of Governments. He does data analysis that covers all sorts of areas relevant to the county of Maricopa County. So we'll proceed in the following order. Preeti will start, then Dick, then Scott. People have a choice of going to the podium or staying here.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. I was counting, I think this is my 6th Rural West, but it's a really special one for the Lane Center. Congratulations on 10 years to the Lane Center and the Eccles family for this incredible rotating conference. It's been a great joy. We've gone at least to 7 or 8 different states. But as Dave mentioned, Stanford often works across units. I'm currently at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, and we partnered with the Lane Center to work on this poll. And I think the Lane Center has a reputation for working across disciplines, but this was the first time I think we've really worked across multiple universities. So as Dave mentioned, we're really pleased to partner with Arizona State and the University of Houston. Let's see if this works. Okay, great. So this was part of a series of reports. We looked at both social, political, and economic issues, really trying to understand who's leaving, why are they leaving, and what happens when they exit California for other Western states. On the Lane Center website, you'll be able to find each one of these reports looking at abortion, transgender legislation and policies, the power of partisanship, and there's a copy of today's report on California's population drain at the front desk. So as Dave mentioned, on the next slide, the poll was conducted at the end of May, early June last year, and had a representative sample from all 3 states, approximately 3,100 respondents with about 1,000 respondents from each state. Now, for those of you who live here in Arizona, you'll recognize what a disproportionate share California and Texas have, right? So Arizona has about 7.5 million residents compared to California's 39 million and Texas's 31 million. So as we're going through, just keep that in mind. And for those of you who follow the news, you know that California exodus has been a favorite topic for reporters, particularly during the pandemic, as we are trying to understand, is this a short-term flight of high-tech workers who are able to work remotely across the country? But really what we discovered is there were fewer births during that time, and as we know, international migration essentially stopped. So we work closely with the California Department of Finance, who issues projections each year to see what does the future of the population look like. And it really does seem that California's population will stagnate. The Department of Finance is projecting that we will peak in 2044 with about 40 million residents and then decline, hovering around 39 million. We'll get into some of the political consequences later, but there's a lot of news around 2020 when we lost our first congressional seat ever in the state's history. So on the next slide, you can see where some of this migration happens. Arizona has a really important part of the story, particularly because of the outsized impact of California outmigration. I will tell you, yesterday upon landing, I met 3 Arizonans at the airport and on our Uber. All of them had come from California here. So anecdotal, but I think you feel that presence of Californians a lot more, and I know, Scott, you're going to talk about this in a little bit. So in our sample, about 15% of Arizonians previously lived in California compared to 5% of Texans, but former Texans and former Arizonans comprise less than 1% of our sample. And on the next slide, we know that the West in general has a reputation for being a destination. It's part of the Western ethos, but California in particular really holds this idea of movement. And so for the past 60 years, we've seen really significant population growth in California, roughly around 1.5%. But since 2000, we've consistently been below, observing some of the slowest growth rates. And what we've seen is that in this sample, native-born populations in all 3 states tended to be younger and non-white versus the migrants who we observed in our sample were older and white. So our friends at the Public Policy Institute of California have really been tracking this, and I think it's no surprise that migration is made up of several components, really: births, net immigration, particularly international deaths, and then, of course, those who are moving within states. For domestic migration, this was most significant in California in the period between July 2021 and July 2022, when we saw a net loss of about 407,000 people. And what you see on the right is that we're losing people at all income levels, and this is particularly concerning for California because about half of our state revenue comes from taxing about our top 1% earners. So we're paying close attention to who's leaving and where they go. So if you look at our sample on the next slide, what you see is there's been a lot of recent movement. So in 2022 to 2023, 6% of those in our sample had moved, primarily leaning more toward the Democrats. But the larger growth of, the larger departure of about 14% in the 2 to 5 year range tended more Republican. And we saw this pool to be younger, primarily under the ages of 45, and more Black and Hispanic residents who were leaving. And we'll get into this a little bit more, but I think one of the issues there's an outsized impact from domestic migration, right? Domestic migrants are more likely to re-register to vote, and you see that political impact more immediately compared to international migrants. So in our sample, we saw primarily 3 main reasons for why people would leave. Personal reasons, which many people, I think across the board, prefer the weather in California, but there are lots of reasons why you might choose Texas or Arizona. Family proximity, job change. In terms of partisanship, 2/3 of our sample said not at all. Politics was not a significant factor, and only about 1/4 said it was somewhat or very important. And politics seemed to matter the most to voters who were under the age of 45, Hispanics and Republicans, those who were leaving California for Arizona and Texas. In terms of socioeconomic factors, this came out in many different ways. As we talked about, California and Texas, like significant state income tax versus no income tax, kind of this idea of different approaches to how you provide services and how you approach regulation in general. And we see that in the next slide. Across the board, folks believe that California is perceived to be a more expensive place to live, regardless of party, demographic, age. But interestingly, there is a mismatch in the perception around urban crime and policing. 77% of Republicans think crime is more common in California, and it's higher, as you see, both in Arizona and Texans thinking that California has a higher crime rate. But we know that this isn't true. California and Texas have equivalent violent crime rates, and Arizona ranks 6th. In terms of let's see, I hope I didn't skip anything. So there's a lot that remains to be seen from this migration. We know that the lower cost of living is attractive in Arizona and Texas. In fact, when we got the results from this poll, Dave Brady called me up and he said, "Preeti, I have bad news for you. You're going to have to move out of California if you want to afford a home." And there are a lot of reasons why people might choose to leave California. Lower taxes, regulation, easier to start businesses. But a lot of this industry will depend on college-educated workers and where they choose to resettle. And we have yet to see what the effects of more hardline social policies like abortion will do to this migration. We also know that this population loss has political consequences. We'll see that here in 2024. I know, Dick, you're going to get into that. And ultimately, our region is really connected, right? Whether it's energy issues, water issues, wildfire, we're going to see the decisions that certain states like California, what we do when we're trying to end the sale of gas-powered vehicles in 2035, what kind of economic consequences will have when Californians go to Nevada, for example, and try and buy a vehicle across the state lines. So our CEPR is working really closely with our state tax board to try and figure out how do we track this kind of economic leakage and what do we know about the policy choices made in California and how do they affect our region. And I think with that, we'll get into a little bit more of what's happening with Texas.
Thank you very much. Dick Murray.
Good morning. A couple of weeks ago, the U.S. Census released their July 1, 2023 population estimates for states and counties, so we get a quick snapshot of how populations have been moving around. Looking at Texas, we see a continuation of the trends of the last quarter century. We're on a track in this decade to add about 4 million people net, as we added 4 million from 10 to 20 and 4 million from 2000 to 2010. So basic stability. This in the face, however, of continuing natural increase decline. So if you're adding that many people, you have to be getting a lot of people who are not from Texas, because we don't have enough natural increase to fill this quota, which is driven, as we'll see in just a moment, by job creation. Basically now our state is growing 1/3 natural increase, the excessive births over deaths, 1/3 domestic migration, California being the #1 donor state, but others around the country also contributing a significant net migration to Texas, and 1/3 international migration, so that we're rapidly seeing an increase in our foreign-born population. In Houston, where I live, 26% of the population now were born outside the United States. And that's a really major factor in contributing to the overall growth of the Houston economy and its other important aspects we'll touch on a little bit. This growth in Texas is, as mentioned, driven by tremendous increases in employment. We are not a state that people retire to, or very much. So in contrast to Arizona, say, we have relatively small retirement communities of out-of-staters. People come to Texas because they can find work there that compensates them, and they can find housing that's more reasonable than in some of the other growth areas around the country, particularly California, of course. So we're a very demographically dynamic state. Some of this reflects the continuing health of the old fossil fuel industries, that despite projections about peak oil and other things that this industry would plateau out and start declining, that now seems to be happening more slowly than a number of folks expect. There have also been changes in the international energy picture that have benefited Texas specifically. Our largest corporation is ExxonMobil. A few years ago, they made a major bet on international investments, the largest in Russia. They wrote that off a year or two ago. We're seeing the domestic fossil fuel industry reconcentrate on opportunities in the United States. And the largest opportunity in the United States in recent years has been in the Permian Basin, which is a geologic formation. When I drove through it first, I said, where the hell is the basin? It's flat as a pool table out here in West Texas. Well, it's down there about 5,000 feet. But, billions of years ago, a lot of stuff died off and settled into deposits. And this oil province was developed about 100 years ago. It's had big ups and downs. When prices were really high, there's a lot of drilling, a lot of production. But when prices went down and the recovery became more costly, you had some classic bust in the Permian. And it looked like 20 years ago it was in long-term decline. A lot of people had gone bankrupt, like George W. Bush, who had tried to follow his father's success in the middle of Texas. But then some folks like George Mitchell, a Texas Aggie graduate, a geologist, improved techniques for fracking and horizontal drilling. And suddenly, as oil prices recovered mostly in the 21st century, these huge deposits that are locked in the shale and other geologic formations became recoverable at prices that made it attractive to drill. So I don't know if you follow other statistics, but the U.S. today is producing about 13.4 million barrels of oil a day. Saudi Arabia is about 10 million. So we're by far the world's largest producer of petroleum. What's driving that? Largely the Permian Basin. 5 to 6 million barrels being produced there. This is an all-time record for the United States in energy production, also producing an enormous amount of natural gas. So this has led to a tremendous reinvestment in the area, created a lot of new Texas billionaires, as the old oil companies suddenly discovered selling off their leases was a really bad idea. They came back in and rebought them at enormously inflated prices. So we have some really, really rich new Texans, some of whom are really, really interesting politically. But that's another story, perhaps. But we're a pretty dynamic state. But if you look at where this growth is occurring in terms of population, it's almost entirely within what's called the Texas Triangle. That's the Dallas-Fort Worth metro area at the top, up near Oklahoma. That's Houston in the southeast corner of Texas. And that's Austin, San Antonio, which are increasingly merging into one metro area in the center of the state. 85% of the growth in Texas in population and about 90% of the growth in productivity is in this Texas Triangle. It's by almost any standard one of the world's most productive regions economically, partly because it's very diverse. Houston is benefiting from the consolidation of the domestic energy industry in the Houston area as companies like Chevron steadily shift operations to Houston. Dallas at Fort Worth used to be a pretty significant oil gas center, much less so now, very different economy, much more high-tech, finance, et cetera. Austin, San Antonio, again, a great and very well-funded university at UT. San Antonio, a unique city that has a lot of military installations, tourism. If you put these together, they're a very resilient economic growth engine, and that's where the growth is occurring. And it's attracting, as noted, a lot of people from around the rest of the U.S. and a lot of people from outside the U.S. How long this will continue? Hard to say, but there's no indication from the most recent data that it's slowing down at all. So, as noted, given the theme of this conference, rural Texas, or rural Southwest, outside of the Permian Basin, where there's been a tremendous amount of job creation, most of rural Texas is losing population. Not unique to Texas or the United States. Around the world, people tend to be leaving the less populated areas and moving to the metro areas that seem to have stronger economies and other factors that attract people. And so we've become an overwhelmingly urban state. And so while we're demographically very dynamic, we've not been very dynamic politically. Texas has been a one-party state almost entirely through its history from the 1830s. For the first century plus, that was a Democratic one-party state. But in the 1980s and 90s, that shifted, and as the conservative voters in the state moved into the Republican Party, we become the most solidly Republican big state in the country. No Democrat has won office in Texas since 1994, in statewide office. And the major change within the state has been within the Republican Party, as it has shifted increasingly in the last 10 years to becoming a much more conservative party, pre-Donald Trump, one should note, starting mostly in 2008 to 2010. So we have a dynamic economy, tremendous population growth,
But the political system has been largely dominated by the fact that a small minority of Texans, about 10% of the adult population, participate in the Republican Party primary. And that has become the effective election in Texas. Again, with Democrats often not bothering to compete or putting up non-competitive candidates, and when they do, losing, typically by 10 points or so, the action has been within the Texas Republican Party. And that party has shifted considerably. The party of George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush is dead. Right now, if you want to attack somebody, link them to the Bushes. That's a huge change from 20 years ago when the Bushes running statewide outperformed local Republicans. So we've said the Republican Party moved significantly to the right on a range of issues. And most recently, engaging in a first-class civil war that's partly about clashes between personalities. When one party becomes very dominant and you have a lot of people in a big state that want to move up, I think tensions are almost inevitable. You only have one governor and 2 Senate spots. You got, a dozen Texans who want to move up. So we have a lot of conflict at the personal level between the governor, Greg Abbott, the lieutenant governor, is very powerful in Texas, Dan Patrick, and our junior senator, Ted Cruz. And so lately we've seen an awful lot of infighting, particularly when the Texas legislature, dominated by Republicans, impeached our Attorney General, Paxson, who was impeached last year, tried in the Senate, and the Senate did not convict, so he continues in office. Very controversial figure. The governor has been, for whatever reasons, making his #1 priority a major expansion of voucher programs. And with all the money from the Permian Basin flowing in, there's plenty of money to pay for this. But that's divided rural Texans who generally don't have any private schools and are not very fond of voucher programs that they see of no benefit to them to oppose. So the governor has become very unhappy with the legislature and set out to defeat a number of Republicans in the most recent primary. The Attorney General, angry that many Republicans voted to impeach him, have gone after an even larger number. So we just had our primary, as in California, on March 5th, and the governor had targeted 10 House members and defeated 5 of them. 3 others were forced into runoffs. Only 2 survived. Paxson had a much longer list because something like 60 Republicans had voted to impeach him. He tried to defeat 37 members of the Republican legislature. He only defeated about 10. 7 were forced into runoffs, including the Speaker of the Texas House, again, a very powerful legislative position, who has a runoff of the 28th of May. So we got a tremendous amount of infighting now with enormous amounts of money being spent in fighting among Republicans. We're a strong lobby state, as you would expect, with a very vibrant economy. We've got a lot of powerful, well-organized interests that have very effective representation in Austin. Like most lobbies, they are pretty closely tied to the status quo, the incumbents, so they're mostly trying to fend off some of the attacks on their legislative allies, pouring a lot of money in. But we've got even more money perhaps coming in from some of those newly minted billionaires that are aligned more with Paxson and the governor. So it's a very interesting local situation, not to be determined finally for this round until late May, and raises the question of, now with the infighting among the dominant party, will some of the underlying demographic changes finally lead to some significant political changes? I have not fared well as a prophet, as I think Dave Brady can attest. People have been talking about Texas turning blue for a hell of a long time, and most of those faces have turned blue, but not the state. So I don't know what's going to happen. I know that it's generally not beneficial to Republicans to have this kind of infighting and spending of a lot of resources. But the Texas Democratic Party is pretty decrepit, disorganized. It has been able, just by sheer dint of the population changes, to gradually take over most of the local positions in the big cities. So we have a contrast between the county judge in Harris County, Houston, was elected 5 years ago, a 27-year-old immigrant born in Bogota, Ms. Hidalgo, who is very much in conflict with the state's political leadership, same usually with the leaders in Austin and Dallas. So we do have some conflict here between these dominant metro areas who have more local Democrats and more progressives, but statewide, Republicans are still very much in a very strong position. Trump has changed the dynamics in Texas. Virtually everybody quickly bent the knee to the rising Republican leader. So there's no meaningful anti-Trump leadership among Republicans in Texas. And Biden is not politically popular in Texas, so the presidential situation tends to keep things likely more status quo. But, none of us knows what the hell's going to happen in this presidential race. My take is it's watching Trump and Biden is like watching the 1944 World Series. How can either team possibly win? These are, by most standards, one of the worst two candidates in terms of electability that we've ever seen in modern presidential politics. But as in 1944, I guess that was the Detroit Tigers, the Chicago Cubs. Somebody will win, but we don't know who in the hell it's going to be. And how that will come down in Texas, not sure. The Democrats do have a strong Senate candidate who will be able to raise $1 gazillion because he's running against Ted Cruz. Anyone in this room could probably raise $50 million if nominated to run against Ted Cruz. It's just an automatic. And in polarized politics, don't underestimate this. You had a long shot candidate in South Carolina, I think Harrison. He raised about $80 million against Lindsey Graham. Well, take Lindsey Graham and multiply him 2 or 3 times, and you've got Ted Cruz. So there'll be plenty of money for the one major statewide race going to the Democrats, and Cruz will be well funded. So we'll have a very financially competitive statewide race, which has not always been the case. But you got to figure the Democrats have a big drag factor in Biden. And the largest question mark in the state is the Hispanic population, which historically has been pretty Democratic, although always at least a quarter Republican, and sometimes Republicans can get as much as 40% of the Latino vote. And Trump started off at the low end, but improved dramatically in 2020. And we've had dozens of polls, including the one that we worked with Stanford on and Arizona State, that show Democrats have really suffered erosion with Latino voters. And that's the fastest growing segment of the Texas electorate. But they're really much more up for grabs than we've seen at any point before. So we have a lot of uncertainties. The one thing that is pretty much certain is the demography is continuing on this trajectory of rapid growth and less growth from traditional sources, more and more from international migration. So it's somewhat ironic to me that a state where our governor has become the sort of model political state leader in attacking immigration has an economy that's incredibly dependent upon immigration, more and more on international migration. A lot of that is legal. A lot of it, however, is undocumented. But the political realities are a bit different than the economic ones. So it's a kind of exciting time in Texas to watch what's going on. We can pretty clearly see the economic advantages of the Texas Triangle are likely going to continue for quite a while. We can also likely and perhaps sadly see much of rural Texas continues to decline. We've got in the West the problems of water that you are terrifically familiar with here in this state, that we just don't have the resources to continue to grow into the 21st century. We've got challenges on the energy front. Texas has a separate grid system. We did make some wise investments in the early part of this last 2 decades to build transmission lines to get wind power from the west to the big cities in the east, but we had a terrible winter storm that knocked out a lot of our power and killed about 700 people 2 years ago. We are still bringing on, however, an awful lot of solar power, particularly in the eastern part of the state where the population and energy demands are tremendous. we've got water issues, we've got energy issues, we've got the political conflicts within the state. Again, it's exciting to be there, but I don't know what the hell's going to happen. But something will change. You can't have this much dynamic shifting without some kind of consequences bleeding into the political process. And how quickly or how slowly, that will depend upon personalities. I mean, none of us saw Trump coming. Many may pray for his leaving, but he's still the dominant political figure in our state, as in every other one of the 49. So, enjoyed coming to your group today, and look forward to the other presenters and your questions.
This thing on? Okay. Yeah, can I? Yeah, I'll take that. Thank you. So thank you for having me. My name is Scott Wilkin. I'm from the Maricopa Association of Governments. We're the Transportation Planning Agency and Air Quality Planning Agency for the Phoenix metro area. So not from a university. I went to a university, but and we're a nonpartisan agency. I told the panel that I'm going to avoid politics or else I'll get myself in trouble, but I can at least talk about the real broad stuff that probably a lot of you know, that Arizona is now, I think, officially a purple state. We have a Democrat in the governor's office and an attorney general's office. We have, for several cycles, we've had the legislature, both houses of the legislature, as close as they could possibly be, 16-14 in the Senate and 31-29 in the House. But Republicans have been in charge of those, so kind of split there. For the first time in a long time, we voted for a Democrat for president 4 years ago. So yeah, we're officially purple state, which means, oh God, the political ads are coming. But I'm going to mainly focus on the research that we've done in migration in regional analytics in our agency, if this will cooperate. There, cool. No, it's working now. So Arizona and Phoenix metro area are growing. You can see their trajectory since 2000. At one point, I had a stat that I like to throw around that I got from the Census Bureau that somebody moved to Maricopa County every 5 minutes. I think that's a little bit old, but it's probably not too far off. But we're growing. No, I got it. Natural growth is flattening. Just the last few years, 2021, you can see the gray line is our natural growth. The other two lines are births and deaths. In 2021, we actually had negative natural growth. So many people were dying during the COVID pandemic, and so many people were not having babies that natural growth was plummeting, which means most of our growth is coming from migration. So you can see the light blue line is in migrants, the darker blue line is out migrants, and then the gray line is the net of those. So we're growing. We've got a lot of people moving here. I moved here a long time ago, 20 years ago, so I'm practically a native. Where are people coming from and where are they going? The top table shows you where people come from when they move here, and you can see California is by far the biggest source of our migration. California is also the place that more people from Arizona are moving to, but the net is far in favor of Arizona. So the migration leak, the economic leak that Preeti talked about, we're big fans of that. You can see a lot of people come from foreign countries, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, but this is kind of a snapshot of the last few years of where people are coming from and going to. Focusing specifically for this conference, this is migration to and from California since, let's see, what are we doing since I think these numbers might be a little off, but the last few years, we'll say. And so you can see we've got big net from California, and we're about flat with Texas, right there. Where are people, I used to say nobody actually lives in Arizona is actually from Arizona. I know people who grew up here, and none of them were born here. So where were people born? You can see almost 40% of Arizonans were actually born in Arizona. Compare that to California and Texas, where well over half of the people who live there were born there. Foreign countries contribute a lot to all three places. Breakdown of that for Arizona, about 50% of that is from Mexico. The other ones moving to Arizona are from India, Canada, Philippines, Germany, Vietnam, and China. Canada is particularly interesting because there was a time in the mid-teens when we had a lot of Canadian investment when the Canadian dollar was very strong against the American dollar, and they saw cheap housing and they bought it up and would come here for the winters and decide they wanted to stay here all the time. So who are the people who are moving here? Largely we're seeing that Arizona immigrants have a higher income than people who are already here. I think a lot of that is the effect of California. And then since 2010, what do we got here? This is migrants from California and Texas have both had higher incomes than Arizona as a whole. As you can see, those are, especially since 2017, both California migrants and Texas residents have made more than Arizona. They're also better educated, so the gray line is Arizona, and then the two blue lines are in and out migrants for the state. We had our team pull this data. This doesn't really tell you a whole lot, except that the numbers are steady, but generally Arizona in-migrants and out-migrants are younger than Arizona residents. And it's not necessarily or solely because we're a popular retirement state. That was the reputation for a long time. But that has definitely shifted. We've still got some large retirement communities, but we've got a lot more of a younger population lately. But younger people have more mobility, and so they're moving in and out of the state. One of the results of this is one of the things that our team has been doing a deep dive in the past few years. We've been looking at housing because we've had kind of a housing affordability crisis. You can see our housing prices have kind of skyrocketed the last few years. Really peaking in 2022, summer and fall of 2022, and they kind of stabilized since then. But it's really caused a lot of problems. People haven't been able to find a home that they can buy. Interest rates going up have kind of trapped people into the homes that they had before the pandemic. I bought my home in 2016. I'm not moving because I would have to I think triple the interest rate or something like that. So people like me are part of the problem, I guess, is what I'm saying. But we've had a big affordability crisis. We've had a lot of talk of solutions. To get, I guess, a little bit back into politics, there's a sentiment at the legislature that the evil cities and towns are responsible for it, and that they should essentially get rid of zoning. The governor just recently vetoed a bill that would have prohibited cities from requiring minimum lot sizes to be any larger than 1,500 square feet. I'll say that again. Cities could not require you to subdivide in a lot any larger than 1,500 square feet. So an apartment, so your lot would 1,500 square feet. So that was apparently the solution, but then she vetoed it. And there were some other things in there too but that one, 1,500 square feet. That one kept getting me. So I'm part of the problem, but also people from California are part of the problem too. Not as much Texas, but still, you guys are all, you guys haven't moved here yet, but when you do, you're gonna pay more than the people who are already here. And that's probably because your house is worth more in California or Texas. And so you sell your house out of state and you see that you can come here and buy something equal size or probably even bigger for about that much money, or maybe even less money. And you got a pretty big house, and then the people who are already here are more and more priced out of it. We've got a slide deck of about 120 to 130 slides into the housing affordability crisis. I'm going to go through all of them. It's not going to take very long. I'm just kidding. I left out all the rent stuff, but the rents are just as bad. There's nothing under $1,500 a month, and that's even shrinking a lot too. So everywhere you look, it's hard to find affordable housing. And another part of the reason for that is seasonal investor. Our data doesn't allow us to separate seasonal residents or seasonal properties from investor properties. But out of a housing stock of about 1.4 million, we've got 368,000 seasonal or investor properties. And you can see this is a map of the Phoenix metro area. Sorry, I've got a mix of state data and Phoenix metro area data, but this one is specifically for the Phoenix metro area. And you can see that those properties are pretty much everywhere. Half of that is from Maricopa County, 42% is from other states, and the top three are California, Washington, and Texas. And then we've got mostly mostly Canadian, like I said, buying the properties and investing them or using them as seasonal or both. So the bottom line is that we're growing. People are moving here. Like I said, every 5 minutes somebody moves here. Every 7 or 8 minutes somebody moves away. So it's still a net gain. That's been the case. That's always been the case, and it's going to continue to be the case. But what if it's not? What if we're wrong? What if everything I just said isn't true? We heard earlier that the Census Bureau just released their county-level population estimates for 2023. And I'm going to be honest, I didn't look at them that much. It's great, we grew. Breaking news. But one of our data scientists looked into it deeply because he's great at his job, and he found something weird. State demographer looked into it too, and what we found was that our domestic migration shrank by almost half statewide, and went from 33,000 net to 2,000 for Maricopa County alone. International migration was pretty steady 1 year to the next, but it's that domestic migration number that caught us off guard. The state demographer talked to the Census Bureau to see what was going on. They said that the data is largely based on IRS tax returns. So earlier I showed a slide with IRS tax returns. We don't have access to the 2023 tax returns, so we don't have any way to counter this or anything, but that's where they said this is coming from. So what's causing this? This is something we're going to be looking into a lot moving forward. There's a couple possibilities. The Census Bureau, as amazing as they are, maybe they just got it wrong 1 year. They're just people. Maybe it's a 1 year blip. Maybe we attracted a lot of people from out of state that are tax cheats and just didn't file any tax returns last year. But I think what's probably more likely is that people used to come here because it was lower cost of living than where they're coming from, cheaper housing, and that's just not as true as it was in the past. Compared to California, probably still true, but not nearly as true, so there may be some other more attractive places easier to move to than Arizona has been in the past. We're still creating tons of jobs, so somebody's got to fill those jobs, and I think that's going to be good for the people coming here to fill them, because as the companies get more and more desperate to fill them, then the wages get higher. But we're going to be watching this, try to figure out what's going on, and we'll see what happens. So this slide alone may have just negated everything else I said today, but we don't know that for sure, and we'll be watching it. That's all I have. I think we have plenty of time for questions.
For questions, I do want to say we have gone in with Arizona State again and Yale, and we're going to have a poll of a panel study where we interview the same people, 112,000 people, 14 to 16 times over the course. And the results we've done 2 of the 112,000 so far, and the results are perfectly consistent with the poll we did in the summer. And those results are pretty straightforward. Unlike the 1970s, where, say, Richard Nixon, 32% of Nixon's vote and 72 came from Democrats. It's no longer true. Democrats and Republicans are sorted now, as Dick pointed out. And so what happened is Democrats vote Democrat and Republicans vote Republican. And that means that there are very few persuadables, Democrats who are willing to vote for Trump and vice versa. And so that plus independence means that the number of people in the country deciding elections is exceedingly small. Exceedingly small. So you can expect a close election. Now with the 3 states, not a problem. If you live in California, You don't need to do anything. California is going Democrat, doesn't matter, which is a break because that means we won't get commercials. None. The only time candidates come to California is to raise money. So Texas will be more competitive, as Dick points out, at least at the Senate level, and so they'll get some commercials. But Arizona, you're in for it. Arizona is, in our recent poll, just like the one we had it in summer. It's very close. Trump has about a 2.5-point lead before the campaign starts. But the bottom line is the number of people that we have various ways to estimate persuadables. The number of persuadables is about 8, maybe 10%, depending upon which of our measures. So you're going to be inundated with, and you're going to be more like the country as a whole. The election here is going to be closer than it is, but in general, that polls that we did, and Pat Kenny has skipped out because he's the one that wrote up the Arizona poll very well. The point is, Arizona is going to be exceedingly competitive. As I told you, much different than California politics. She just came from Stanford, so you'll see that it's a little bit different. Turn your TV off. Okay, we'll now turn to questions with that for anybody. So, all the way in the back. Is that you, Pat? Okay.
It's me.
Yeah.
The Maricopa County planner, could you answer this question? In biology and ecology, there's what's called a carrying capacity, and it determines how many visitors can go to a national park or a national forest. Does anybody in your business look at the correlation of the availability of water to how much population it can serve?
By the way, that question comes from a former head of the Bureau of Land Management. So,
The answer to the question is yes. Do we look at that at Maricopa Association of Governments? Absolutely not. That is not our specialty. That's not our bailiwick. We stay out of water. But some of you may know the name Grady Gamage, a local land use attorney. The Performing Arts Center down the street from here is named after his dad, who worked with Frank Lloyd Wright. Grady Gamage, for the last 20-some years, has been going around the state talking about water. He talks about the water buffaloes who have been basically in charge of Arizona water policy. And his message is kind of like, they're great at their job, leave them alone. They know what they're doing. We're fine. He's changed that a little bit the last few years. But the thing that people outside, and I also need to tread lightly because MAG does not get into water. But the thing that Grady talks about that Arizona did that you don't get when you're reading articles about how we don't have any water in the New York Times or whatever, is that something like 40 or 50 years ago, the water buffaloes came up with a plan to make sure we have plenty of water. And that plan is working great. And our neighbors didn't do that. But we've got the canals, we've got the reservoirs, we've got groundwater replenishment. We've got specific rules about 100-year water supply before you can get subdivision plat in certain areas of the state. And so it's not easy, and it'll never be easy, but it's not the crisis that it sounds like it should be, because it doesn't rain here. It's so when people look at water availability and water capacity, yeah, we do look at that. And there are certain areas, even in this region, where they may have some difficulty in the future getting more subdivision plats approved because of the groundwater availability or lack thereof. Cost of water is a different issue, but availability of water, for the most part, we're okay, I think, is a way to do it. One of the things that our department does, by the way, is we do long-range socioeconomic projections, housing, population, and employment. We do it every 3 or 4 years, and the model is primarily based on land use plans and general plans of the cities and towns. And when we have our draft plan, our draft projections, we go out and we meet with as many cities and towns as we can. We meet with planners mostly, but we also try to get people from infrastructure. And this time, when we did it about a year ago, we asked every single person that we met with, every single city and town, if they have any concerns about water. Is there any maximum capacity that we need to know about that you can't serve beyond? And they all said, nope, we're fine. So, we're fine.
Sorry. Yep.
First off, thank you to ASU for hosting this and for Stanford making its presence here on the campus. It's really appreciated by all of us. Rarely do I find myself a statistic in a presentation, and this might be the first time. So I moved here in 2020 from California. I looked at Texas and Arizona and Florida for my company, and we came with about 50,000 jobs. My observation is that this migration is not organized at all by the states. It's pretty random. And could there be a way for the states to distinguish between the people they want and they don't, and to coordinate the migration? And I could give you some very big macro reasons why Arizona is benefiting right now from California's lack of coordination. And that's going to continue unless Arizona decides to take a different path. And then Texas benefits from all the United States. But does Texas like that migration? So the question is, you are all looking in the past, but to the future. Can you manage it? Can you control it? Can you make it a benefit for the residents?
Who wants to take that?
I can real quickly just talk about it. In one sense, we kind of are, because we've got Arizona Commerce Authority, we've got the Greater Phoenix Economic Council, which are basically economic development agencies for the state, for the Phoenix metro area, and there's lots of other ones. And they're targeting specific businesses. So if they target businesses that hire specific types of people, then by default they're targeting those types of people to hopefully move here. Beyond that, I don't know what you could do. We're still a free market state, free market country, and so if you want to move your business here, and with the people we don't want are working for you, whoever that is, you can still do that. But that's the closest thing I could think of off the top of my head.
Anybody else? Breedy?
Yeah, I guess I would just add, I just finished 2 terms as a planning commissioner in Silicon Valley, and I think until we figure out the housing crisis, this is going to happen based on where people can buy homes, and we just have not been producing enough supply for the past 3 or 4 decades, and so a lot of this will just be natural as people choose the market where they can afford, and then workers follow.
Dick, anything?
I find the housing component quite fascinating, particularly the contrast between, say, Texas and California. One of the factors that has helped us somewhat in Texas is that we have been able to create a lot more somewhat affordable housing than other states. Because we got a lot of land, and it's buildable land. You know, most of Texas you can build things on, unlike much of California and a lot of Arizona. A lot of land, pretty good water in the eastern half of the state, and an unusual regulatory structure. Texas gives municipalities a tremendous amount of power of control over things like land use, not for counties that are severely restricted. So this creates an opportunity of a kind of true Wild West in housing outside of incorporated cities. And a good contrast I find between our state and California, these 2 projects that have emerged, one out of the wild, unregulated free market that we find in Metro Houston, where 40 miles northeast of downtown Houston, there's something called Colony Ridge that's emerged. A couple of Texas entrepreneurs went out and quietly bought 33,000 acres outside of any municipality, and started selling lots, big lots, to mostly undocumented folks who didn't have bank accounts or social security numbers, and charging them unbelievably high interest rates, a higher level of default. By some estimates, there are now 50,000 people living in this development. And it became a national story to some degree when allegations were made that these were lots of folks that were involved in transporting fentanyl and cartels and so forth, which were almost entirely untrue. Meantime, 40, 50 miles northeast of downtown San Francisco in Solano County, you have some Silicon Valley entrepreneurs who go out and quietly buy a lot of land, a lot more than the Texas guys, But they completed the purchase. I don't think a single resident has been added to the housing
zero,
stock.
yeah.
And so it's very messy in Texas, but it does produce a lot more housing. You have in place a huge number of builders and developers and all the way down to carpenters and roofers and so forth. And all the talk about creating affordable housing, how in the hell do you create the underlying structure of all the workers and financing and et cetera that are needed? So Texas certainly isn't necessarily a model. Colony Ridge is being sued by the feds and the state, but they've created a lot of housing that's relatively affordable. And, looking at the inflation of the numbers, and Austin looks a lot like Arizona. Austin's median price is about the same as here in Maricopa County. So the tremendous growth in jobs and incomes is meaning that some of the metro Texas areas are just beginning to get into the problems that we're seeing here in Maricopa County, that the locals are just being priced out of the market. And, you're stuck in your house, you can't refinance. So the Texas housing advantage in the areas where the jobs are being created is almost certainly going to rapidly decline. First in Austin, next in Dallas, and finally in Houston and San Antonio. But it's still pretty real in at least Houston and San Antonio. But we don't have a national housing policy that's working at the metro areas level.
All right, thanks. Other questions? Yep. Wait for the mic.
In 1980, I lived in England, and I couldn't rent a house. And the reason I couldn't rent a house is England's had rent control for 200 years, and they've patched every loophole successfully. Correspondingly, 55% of all the homes in England are rented, just like the US, but they're all government-owned and government-maintained. And they paid me money to locate up by Liverpool, not London, because there the jobs have to move to the people, because the people can't move to the job. When you get out of high school, you get a home, and it's called a council house, and that's the only one you're allowed to get, so you can't move, and unless you make enough money to buy a home, which are very expensive, you can't do it. And so I'm a big fan of CFR, and I wish they would do a study of housing shortages and rent control areas. I suspect Texas doesn't have rent control. California now has made it statewide, and as a result, there's a lot of places not rented because you can't get people out. And a friend of mine had a rent control apartment on Nob Hill, 3-bedroom apartment, because the rent was so reasonable after 20 years, he kicked his roommates out. And so the density in an apartment goes way down when you have rent control, which causes more of a housing shortage. Anyway, I would encourage CFR to study this. That would be very informative, because I may be totally wrong. And to get around rent control, because poor people need housing, you give them a check, you don't give them rent control. And then they can shop, they can move, they can, manage their money that way. I don't really have a question.
I noticed, yeah.
Sorry.
All the way in the back? Dick, you don't have a question, Bruce. Good. We're not taking your questions.
My
Yes.
question is for Preeti, and I think you mentioned the statistic that California's tax revenue is largely or half from the top 1%. And just an observation that leads to a question, they're probably, a top 1%er in California is probably worth 20 million or 50 million or some big number like that, and probably less sensitive to tax rates. I'm a little bit more interested in the next cut, maybe the next 20% that is well enough off to move, but yet is impacted by the tax rates. And I wonder if there's been a lot of like retired defense engineers from Orange County that have moved out, and a lot of middle managers from Silicon Valley that move out once they make their 5 million. So that's what I wonder about.
Yeah, I will say tax data is really, really hard to come by. We're working very hard. I think one thing that we have been able to do is look at those who remain, people who leave California sometimes have part-time status, and so we're able to track some of their behavior through filing of part-time residence. Josh Rao has a paper that's coming out soon about what he's found, and sees that while those people are more sensitive to taxes, we haven't seen the behavior that you would expect. It's certainly an area we can look further into.
Other questions, comments? I know it. All right, microphone up here. The director has a question.
Yes, last Rural West, I was not allowed to ask a question, even though I'm the director. So this is a privilege. Thank you very much. So look, I want to go to Dick Murray on this one, which is about the Latino population. First of all, I gather, maybe you can confirm or disconfirm, that what you're dealing with now is, according to the press, not so much migration from Mexico, but the refugee issue from all over the place. But this whole business that we saw in the last election, where the Latinos were voting Republican and going for Trump, was largely concentrated in Texas and Florida, and heavily in the areas that were closest to the border, which suggests that it's really the irritation of the migration on the border that was driving public opinion, at least in Texas and Florida. Do you see, that that's the continuing sort of issue with them, or is it a greater solidarity with some of the court decisions, like the abortion decision, since many of them are Catholic and very conservative? And do you see it generalizing across a broader swath of Texas, or is it still heavily concentrated on the South?
I think, but as your question suggests, the biggest change in Texas in the Latino voting pattern has been along the border. We saw in Starr County a shift from Trump getting, I think, around 22% of the vote when he ran in 2016 to 47% in 2020, a 25% swing. Away from the border, where the greater majority of the Latino population lives, in Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, Austin, San Antonio, the shift was about 6 to 8 points. Still significant, very similar to what happened in Los Angeles. Nationally, there's a pattern. Florida and the Texas border are outliers, much larger shifts. Along the Texas border, I think one of the factors has been immigration from Mexico has declined dramatically. Lower birth rates since 2000, many fewer young people, improved economy, more jobs being created. So the folks that are crossing the border now, and it really impact local residents, of course, as here in Arizona, are not of Mexican origin. Used to be a lot more Central Americans, now it's shifting to the world. So you don't have much of a sense of identity or solidarity. These folks don't speak Spanish, and they're from Africa, China, whatever. And I think that's a driving factor, that there's just more of them. The big cities in Texas are largely insulated from the big downside of immediate massive immigration. That's happening somewhere else. We're the beneficiaries. We get all the cheap labor, and very few of the downsides. Now, a lot of the folks crossing the border, of course, are being, with a little assistance from our governor, moved on to Chicago, New York, Denver, Los Angeles, making it a different kind of political issue. Again, the Latino population in Texas, now about 12 or 13 million, is one of the big question marks in the national electorate. Where do they go? They are registering and to some degree voting more in presidential elections. They could, if Trump had performed as poorly in 2020 as he did in 2016 with Hispanics, Texas would have been a 50-50 state, like Arizona. But Trump's 600,000 vote margin out of 12 million was accounted for largely by his improvement with Hispanic voters.
Let me do a follow-up question on the abortion link, and then I'll cede the microphone. But having been part of the group that did the analysis, one thing that we haven't really mentioned is the divergence on public opinion across the 3 states on abortion. And what we saw in the survey was that California and Texas, are the opposite ends on the abortion issue. And if you looked at Arizona, Arizona's median preference was for the 15 weeks. And so there's a consistency in Arizona between where public opinion is and where the law is. In California, the preference is to go back to prior to the Dobbs decision. And that seems to be consistently represented. But what's interesting is Texas, because the biggest discrepancy is in Texas, where they have perhaps the most strict abortion law in the country, and at the same time, it looks like 15 weeks is more like what the median voter is. So how does that play out in terms of the way the 2024 election, particularly on the down ticket races, the congressional races? I would think that that would make it pretty hard where you have well-educated people moving into the state. You would think that some of that migration may affect some of the congressional races. Is that possibly true? It might not affect the overall election with Trump, but it might show out in the down races. Is that possible?
Well, in Texas, we had a very successful redistricting by the Republicans in control. You and I have worked on redistricting plans. I would give this one an A+. It was very, very cleverly drawn. It's undermined in part over time by the shifting populations. You start a district off, they look great, and then right now we have 3 quite competitive districts, all significantly Hispanic, out of 38. So in the House, we're not as nearly as big a player as New York or California, not the same probably as Arizona. 2 or 3 seats could shift. The Senate, again, figures to be a very interesting national race and a marquee race. More money spent in Texas than any other Senate race. Not much else on the ballot. To me, as a native, the greatest opportunity for change in Texas is the state house. You have a constitutional rule in Texas. You cannot cross county lines to redistrict the state house, unless you have to. And this means that all the big urban counties, all your redistricting has to occur within the box of the boundaries of Harris County. And it really limits your ability to draw clever districts. And so you have in the House about 12 or 15 very competitive districts, some of which have become more so because incumbent Republicans representing the more moderate position on things like abortion have been defeated in the primary. So you actually have some real opportunity for a change of control. The current House is 86 Republicans and 64 Democrats. I think Democrats will win a half dozen seats, but in Virginia, a few years ago, Larry Sabato, one of the local analysts, said, well, the Democrats might pick up 3 or 4 seats. Well, they picked up 15. So these shifts sometimes go a little bit more than we prognosticators imagine. So yeah, it's a down ballot race. Nobody pays too much attention, but control of a legislative body in a one-party state is mighty important if the out party can get it. So personally, I'm most looking at the Senate race and the state House races in Texas because we have enough competitive districts to actually change control.
Good. Other questions, comments? 10, 9, 8. Yep, question.
Quick question in connection to the immigration from California to Arizona and the 2024 elections. Do you think that there will be an impact of the Californians voting in Arizona in the election? What are the voting preferences of the Californians that have been moving to Arizona? If there is any data on that.
Anybody?
I'm not a political scientist. I don't want to get too deep into politics, but that makes sense that the number of Californians coming to Arizona is one of the big drivers in the purpling of the state. We don't do any research on that, so I don't have any numbers, but anecdotally, that seems likely.
Are you on the panel? No, just kidding.
I got to do your job for you, Brady.
Yeah.
I actually did write on that part. And the answer is that you do see across the different states that of all the states, California's had the most political impact on Arizona, largely because Texas is so damn big that even though we're sending some liberals over there to try to blew you out or something, that's not going to happen anytime soon because there's such a large population. But if you look at Arizona, it has turned purple in part. But what we've done, if you break down the migration into Arizona, it turns out to be both red and blue, and that's why it's purple. You get the older retirees that are coming in that tend to be a little more conservative, and you get the younger population that's moving into the urban areas that is driving up the price, but also bringing in more Democratic support. So I wouldn't say that it's tilting it, it's just keeping it purple, which is another way of saying that you're going to be purple for a while, is my guess. And that means you'll be in the eye of the storm year after year, probably, for the foreseeable future.
If the person who asked that question can give me your email after this, we have, on that 112,000 person sample, we have a huge number from Arizona because it's a competitive state. And we do have a question on the demographics about where you move from. So I can, I don't have the data with me, but I can look that up very quickly.
Can I just add real quickly on your point that I think I don't have any data and I don't do this for a living, but it seems like the interesting thing is going to be the self-sorting, that if you are a California liberal moving to Arizona, you're probably more likely to move to Phoenix, which is a majority minority city, 1.6, 1.7 million people, maybe Tucson, places like that, but the rest of the state also gets to vote for state legislature, for example. So it can have a big effect on statewide races. That's why we have Governor Hobbs in the governor's office. But the legislature is going to be that's going to be the real interesting factor, because not so much moving to the rural parts of the states.
Yeah, Pat?
Dave, I was just going to follow up on Bruce's comment because I was on this study.
Yeah, I mentioned our findings while you were gone.
Yeah, okay. And so to Bruce's point, if Democrats and Republicans look very similar on their issue positions across all three states. So if Democrats are moving from California, it's going to support the Democratic vote. If Republicans are moving, it's going to support the Republican vote. The independents vary depending on the issue. Sometimes they're closer to the Democrats, and sometimes they're closer to the Republicans. So we'll have to see what kind of vote. It's an easy state to be an independent in now. About 1/3 are registered independents. It's about third, so that may make a difference. The thing to remember on all of our statewide races lately, they are incredibly close. So the presidential election was 10,000, give or take. The gubernatorial election, very close. Senate election, not Kelly's election, but the other election, very close. So, we're down in the small percentage. Less than 1% may tip that. So it could make a difference. So could 20 other things because it's so close. So anyway.
Thank you. Other questions? Yeah, we have a question right here. Yeah.
How has American Indian Nation water rights impact growth, and also the growth due to the reservations on north and east?
Are you for Arizona?
I'm talking to you.
For Arizona?
Because,
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't have a whole lot of information on this. We mainly deal with the three Native nations in the Phoenix metro area. And I know Native nations, I think generally or all have senior water rights. I know there are some nations that are talking about trying to transfer that in exchange for something. I know that there are some other nations that are not as happy about the deal that is being proposed for Colorado, the big river over there. But in Phoenix MSA, We've talked to, we mainly talk to Salt River Pima, Maricopa Indian community when we do our projections review. We've got the best contacts there, and they, again, told us no issues with water. I don't think I'm answering your question. That's probably because I don't have a good answer.
Yeah, we get a microphone
Great.
back there.
That question. Hi, I'm Deb Kroll, Indigenous Affairs reporter with the Arizona Republic. I've been reporting on tribal water for longer than I can imagine. So the answer to that question is, some of that's going to be answered this afternoon at the water session. But basically, you know, tribes do have senior water rights, particularly Colorado River Indian tribes, the other tribes of the Colorado River Valley, which would be Quetzon, Cocopah, Fort Mojave. Gila River Indian Community has senior water rights. The thing is it's one thing to have rights, and as my reporting indicates, another to actually use them. We do know that CRIT had finally, after 20 years, gotten congressional approval to lease some of its water. They have excess water that if they don't use it, it goes down to Colorado and they lose any benefit that they have. The same thing with some of the other tribes that have their adjudicated water rights are leasing their water. And please don't confuse lease with sell, because the tribes will never sell their water, but they will certainly lease it. Another thing is that when the 7 basin states divvied up the water back in 1822 with the Colorado River Compact, tribes were barely mentioned. And so there's always been this tussle. States are negotiating. The tribes are increasingly saying, we hold 20% of the water rights in the entire basin. We hold 40% of the water rights in Arizona. We need to be at the same table as the rest of the states in determining the next set of river guidelines. So, yeah, tribes do have a lot to say. You're going to see that they're going to be saying a lot more, and they are basically going to try and leverage those rights to make sure that first their rights protected, and then second of all, they're able to lease some of that water to the rest of the state.
Good, thank you. Anybody respond to that? No? Good. Questions?
Thank you. I think I'll save my comments on water for a little later at the panel this afternoon. But my question, my question has to do with this migration. In the 1950s, the United States government had a relocation program in which they were relocating tribal members onto the cities for training and for jobs and so forth. My brother was sent to Dallas, Texas to learn to be a barber, for example. And he met his wife there in Texas. She was from Oklahoma, and she was being trained to become a beautician and so forth. That was the 1950s. Now, those families have grown up in the cities, especially in the Los Angeles area. And those families now want to come home. And when they're coming home, there's no place for them. There's no home, so we don't have any. Housing has become a major problem. So my question is, has there been any studies done on the migration patterns of tribal people, especially with considering the relocation program?
Scott, anybody on the panel?
We haven't done anything on that. We have looked into doing some demographic reports on the Native nations themselves, and one part of the discussion was off-reservation population, but we as far as I know, we don't have any data on that. We could tell percentages of Native Americans in the cities, but we don't know, what tribe they would be part of or anything like that. But it's interesting. It'd be a great study, but we haven't done anything with that yet.
Yeah. Yeah, that is I found I agree, that's very interesting, and I don't know why there aren't any. Other questions? Yep.
So I have a question related to why, the topic of the conference is the changing rural Southwest. Having lived here in Arizona for over 40 years now, one of the things that puzzles me is why it is that the political situation in the rural counties in Arizona has changed so slowly. We've had Republican domination in the state Senate and in the House for pretty much as long as I've been here, and I've never understood why it is that there's been such prolonged dominance by the Republicans in the rural communities. Do any of you have suggestions about that or thoughts about that and the likelihood that it could change?
I don't, just take a shot at it. Say if you looked at Texas with a long period of Democratic dominance, why did it take so long? I mean, the main driver of it in the U.S. as well was the Reagan era, in which was our party sorting. So if you looked at in 1980, before the 1980 election, for people who said they were conservative, when you ask them, I think, are you liberal? 40% of people who said they were conservative were Democrats. So what happened during that era was there was a sorting, and the conservatives moved to the Republican Party, and what liberals there were, and the Republican Party moved into the Democratic Party. And that sorting has made a difference, made Texas more Republican, and it made Arizona more Democratic. That would be my answer, but Pat Kenny is there, and he did the actual thing, and so I'm putting him on a spot. He'll need a microphone to be on the spot, yeah.
I think that the history of that, so we do know, let me back up for a second. We do know nationally, we do know nationally that the rural areas across the country are more conservative and more Republican. We do know that from all the voting data we have. I think Arizona looks a little like that. I think Arizona looks a little like that, like the rest of the country. And I think what might have shifted a little bit is the level of intensity of conservatism in the rural areas, which I think back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s were a little bit more moderate, and now are quite conservative. We see that in the voting districts. We see that in the in not only House districts, but state districts. Now, there is a shift going on in Arizona, though, as you know well. Currently, both houses only have a one-seat lead from the Republicans. That's about as tight as you can get. The Democrats have thought they're going to switch that a number of times and have been unable to do it, but it's obviously within striking distance now. And some of that has to do with where the populations are and where the lines have been drawn, which is classic kind of American politics. Yeah. I was just looking at Mayor Goddard there. He may want to say something about that. No, he doesn't. Okay.
Yeah. We do know from national surveys that people in rural areas feel they feel left out. They feel as though the government has neglected them, hasn't thought about them, both parties. And so that makes sort of a difference. So they're less happy with the federal government, have been for some time. So that's a part of it also. Yep.
Mine is a comment. There's a book out of Stanford called Our Political Nature. Fascinating book, and he hypothesizes, not proves, that there were two survival methods in the early days of mankind. One was hunker down, stay in your village and keep strangers out, and the other was wandering to better farming lands, a better opportunity. And he hypothesizes that still exists today. If you have high foreign-born population, it's a very liberal city. Rural areas, the people that live there tend to have been born there. That's the hunker downs. Hunker downs are conservative, and wanderers are liberal, and it would be fascinating if there was any way to test that. I don't remember the author's name, but it is out of Stanford.
Well, I do know one corollary, but hunkering down has to do with guns, and there are more guns in rural areas. Just kidding, just kidding. Questions? Yep, all the way in the back. Yep, they see you, they're coming.
Hi. I'm just going to piggy off that one part, though. I think there's a whole discussion around the colonial nature of the westward expansion that dominates how the Southwest has been created beyond the indigenous peoples and tribes, even though that is also a byproduct of being pushed out of their own native lands. But for the panel themselves, I think I have a question around unity and what is possible, like even just amongst these 3 states, that we could also broaden it with this conference around the Southwest, where there's so many commonalities, the issues around water. As you were just mentioning, the high migration rates between these 3 states, what are things beyond the scarcity of water that you see could be unifying parts about unifying as a larger district?
Who wants to take that?
Well, I think one thing we didn't talk about a lot today, but I think there are a lot of climate goals that we share. We know that wildfire, drought, these things don't care about geographical boundaries. And so to the extent that we see it as a region and really want to coordinate across that, but it depends on alignment. And if we have such partisan divides, right, what California sees as a goal is perhaps not what Arizona or Nevada or Texas, right? So I think that to the extent that there are things around the grid, water management where we can find consensus, we really need to be working in that direction.
Yeah, I think there's common problems, but the polarization sort of drives the policy solutions. I don't know, there are people who know more about water in the West, stuff like that, than I do, but it strikes me that polarization affects a lot of these things. Is that wrong, Bruce? No. Okay, all right, stop. He agreed with me. We're done. Time to move on, yeah. Questions? Bruce says to end it, give people more time for coffee. So with that, we are ending. I'd like to thank the panel and the audience. Thanks a lot.